Hi, my name is Erica Deal, and this is my presentation on building a METS application profile. For this project, I chose to look at materials from the Prohibition exhibit in the Digital Public Library of America. The DPLA was a suitable collection because it faces multiple challenges that METS is designed to solve. The Prohibition exhibit is a specific subset of DPLA that deals with the temperance movement, alcohol ban, and policy reversal that occurred in the United States during the first several decades of the 20th century. The collection provides insight into perceptions of alcohol in different parts of the country and includes texts, images, interviews, and photographs of objects pertaining to prohibition. Since the collection is able to draw on the resources of so many different repositories, it provides an unusually rich online experience, much like a physical museum. The DPLA is a completely digital collection composed of objects loaned by other institutions. According to the METS website, METS is specifically designed to deal with digital objects and facilitate the sharing of metadata between different repositories. The DPLA aims to share most of its public domain objects with software developers through its API, with educators and other institutions. So a good metadata solution is essential. A METS AP would help meet all of these needs in a standardized way while helping DPLA to keep track of the complicated rights and permissions that come with each object. The DPLA consists of more than 5 million digital objects in various formats. Although exact numbers are not available, searches suggest that there are about twice as many text objects as image objects, and a much smaller number of audio and video files. With this ratio in mind, I selected MODS as the basis for the collection because it handles text objects particularly well and can express relationships between the digital version, the original version, and the host institution or collection. Although VRA can do the same thing, I decided against it because the collection is primarily text-based, or the DPLA collection is primarily text-based, and the images largely do not focus on visual culture, which is more the forte of VRA. Furthermore, a quick investigation into parent collections for several items showed that most of them use MODS or Dublin Core to record their metadata, so I thought that using MODS would mean a lower barrier to transferring the data from one institution to another initially. Next, I selected Mix to handle more detailed information related to the digital images and digitized books. Each record in DPLA leads back to a detailed host institution record that contains information about how the digital object was created and the object it was based on. This is useful information for DPLA and for other institutions that may have an interest in using that object for other purposes. Finally, I decided to use the METS rights extension to record rights information about each digital object. I chose METS rights instead of something else like premise because the information available was largely very simple and did not necessitate a more complicated set of terms. I built my local application profile by using MODS as a base and importing Mix and METS rights into the schema. I then added the Mix and Rights Declaration MD elements, which are the roots of Mix and METS rights, respectively, as children of the MODS element, and removed any terms I thought the collection did not need. These mainly included terms pertaining to things like physical location, genre, details about image capture that would probably not be useful in the context of DPLA, and things like that. Although some of this information is available from parent institutions, the rate at which DPLA takes on new records suggests that a balance between simplicity and thoroughness is probably going to be key to a successful AP for this particular collection. I decided to combine everything into one AP for the sake of simplifying data entry and so that each MODS element contained all relevant data about a given object. In other words, I decided to do this instead of entering all of the data in 3 separate instances and then importing all of those schemas into METS. This reduced the amount of cross-checking I had to do when transferring the data to the METS instance file. My next step was to enter data about each object I selected into an instance file. I selected 3 images, 2 were based on photographs and 1 was based on a map collection. a video file that was an interview of somebody who had been involved in the distilling process during Prohibition, and a text file that was mainly composed of a pamphlet about Prohibition, in order to show the range of how the AP could be used and all the different kinds of objects that could go in it. DPLA itself had very little information about each object. There were only about 4 or 5 fields per object, one of which was a link to the host institution. So I ended up following those links to the location of the object in their host repositories and took information from those records. Information ranged from very complete to very spare. This seemed to depend on the kind of institution from which the information came. For example, the Utah State Historical Society had very detailed information down to the metadata cataloger and the scanner model that was used to digitize a photograph, while the Hathi Trust really just lists very basic bibliographic information and doesn't include a lot of information about where it came from or how the digital object was created. So this became sort of a challenge in building the instance file because some of the records were very short and others were very long. So it was in some ways a little bit difficult to show off exactly how flexible the AP actually was. The next step after creating the instance file and gathering as much data about each digital object as I could was to import the local schema into a METS schema, generate an instance file, and paste all of the data into that instance. There were no real complications at this stage. All I really did was take a standard METS instance and import the local AP I had created from mix and METS rights and mods, and then generate an instance file from that. I did have to make some decisions about whether and how to use source MD and digiprov MD, the two sections of the administrative data, or AMD-sec. Eventually, I decided to use those elements to be as specific as possible about the nature of the administrative information. The most challenging part was deciding how to construct relationships between the different sections in the absence of information about the specific digital files. Several of my items consisted of multiple files. For example, the map image was actually part of a set of 10 maps that were initially part of a book. And their entries would have made more sense in conjunction with the file section that could have actually had pointers to all of those different files and shown the whole structure of the digital object. This portion showed me how all of the parts of METS are really reliant on each other and how important it is to be able to record file information to express each record completely. Once I finished the METS instance, I created the data dictionary and write-up for the project so that I could present the theoretical client with a complete set of supporting materials. I would say that the biggest obstacle for this project was the lack of available metadata to determine how the schema should really be set up. For example, if I had had access to the file information or the provenance information for many of the objects, or could have seen a complete metadata record for many of them, I might have determined that VRA was a more appropriate base schema after all. As it was, I had to use my best judgment based on the information that was available, and it definitely showed how important it is for DPLA to have a really good AP solution because it was actually quite difficult to track down very much information about the objects that it had in its collection. METS was especially interesting to me in that it standardizes how information is transferred between institutions, which is really going to be essential to digital repositories that want their artifacts to be used and reused by software developers and the general public. It made me think in more specific terms about what each piece of information was really for and how it might be used because I had to enter it into the right places. It was more than just gathering as much information about a digital object as possible. It would have been great to tie it all together by creating the structure of all of the files that make up the digital object, but that was beyond the scope of this project, and I'll just have to keep METS in mind for any future case in which I would have to solve a similar kind of problem. So that's my METS project from beginning to end. Thank you for listening.